So as you know, Luke, this has been a really exciting political season with respect to political news. Marjorie Taylor Greene wrote a book. George Santos was expelled from Congress. Kevin McCarthy has announced that he's leaving Congress before the end of his term, shrinking that razor-thin Republican majority. All of these things, and of course everything related to Donald Trump, are national headline getters and attention getters. But one of the things that I think is just as important as any of those things is the Republican Party's sustained attack on voting rights in this country. It's been going on for decades. And just a couple of weeks ago, the right wing in this country scored a decisive victory, which is great for them and terrible for literally everybody else. And we need to talk about it. So I'd like to show this clip from Rachel Maddow, which breaks it down.
Well, tonight's ruling upends almost 60 years of precedent in which, as you noted, individuals and civil rights groups have enforced Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act to make sure that our country has a democracy that is free from racial discrimination. It's something that we've never fully achieved, but the Voting Rights Act and Section 2 in particular has done such muscular work to advance us toward this goal. And this is the first decision to say unequivocally that individuals and civil rights groups like the Legal Defense Fund cannot bring lawsuits under this key provision. And it's interesting that you bring up Shelby County versus Holder, which, as you noted, 10 years ago gutted what was the most transformative provision of the Voting Rights Act, Section 5. And in that decision, Chief Justice Roberts, in striking down that key part of the Voting Rights Act, pointed to Section 2 and said, you can still use Section 2 to vindicate your rights. There's still a vehicle to address racial discrimination in our elections. And yet, a panel of the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals in this country said no. Individual voters, citizens, civil rights groups, good government groups who have brought litigation under Section 2 for decades now can no longer do that. And the only possible vehicle is through the Department of Justice and the U.S. Attorney General.
All right, Lisa, before I turn it over to you, because I definitely want your take on this, I just also want to provide some additional context. They're referring to a court case between the NAACP and the Legal Defense Fund. Janai Nelson is the president of that. And essentially Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the governor of Arkansas, and by nature, the Republican Party as a whole. And it was the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals that heard this case, and it is conservative. 2 of the 3 justices or judges were appointed by Donald Trump, and the other one was appointed by George W. Bush, and it was a 2v1 decision. But as a result, this is what happened. They've essentially made it so that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is no longer justiciable by private citizens. Essentially, these activist groups, the NAACP, private citizens can't go to court and say, listen, this voting map, this voting rule, these redistricting laws, they are unconstitutional, they're gerrymandered, they're bigoted. The only way these laws can be challenged is through the Attorney General of the United States. And for reasons I definitely want to get into, that is incredibly problematic. But do you have any thoughts about some of this?
Yeah, in some of the reporting, this is from Reuters. It says, for instance, the case that prompted the Supreme Court earlier this year to strike down Alabama's congressional map was originally filed by a coalition of civil rights groups. I've talked about, I know you have this Alabama congressional map, and they tried over and over to not add that second majority black district. And it was taking away in a severe way the voice, the say in the democratic process of black voters in the state of Alabama. That wouldn't have been knocked down, at least in the way that it played out, if this had been decided earlier. And that's super frightening. I do think this serves as yet another reminder. I know judicial appointees, that discussion following that isn't the sexiest thing in the world, but it's so consequential. And to not name any names, I'm reminded of people in the past who have downplayed that going into election and downplayed the difference between who different presidential candidates would end up putting onto the bench in the case of what I'm thinking of when it comes to the Supreme Court. But across the board, it has such an impact. It relates to the rights of people, voting rights in this case. And so it's sometimes even hard to remember how many things are at stake in this election in 2024 and all of the different elections across the country. but so much is at stake. And this is yet another example of that.
No, I mean, that's an excellent point. I mean, I didn't even think about that, but it does in a roundabout way bring us right back to the 2024 election, as most political topics do, whether we like it or not, which is judicial appointments are the most enduring element of a president's legacy, right? Because they make all judicial appointments, obviously with advice and consent of the Senate. But that's why it's important to elect the right president and the right Senate. And in this case, the right means anything but the right. It means anything but the Republicans. And it's so the partisanship here is so interesting because, again, this is a generally conservative appellate court. And all three of the judges in question are conservative. 2 Trump appointees, 1 Bush appointee. Even the Bush appointee thought that this was ridiculous, that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act was clearly intended, by the way, as contemporaneous iterations of the Senate and the House confirmed all the way back in like the 80s. I think it was one of the times that the Voting Rights Act was reaffirmed. You know, you had the Senate Judiciary Committee and the House Judiciary Committee say, yes, Section 2 is intended to allow citizens and activist groups and civil rights groups to bring suit to help defend the right to vote. And so, I mean, we have documentation of that, but it's pretty easy to see. None of us are mind readers, but we can't help but notice that this aligns with the right wing's goal to restrict voter turnout. They are under the impression, not just we on the left, the right is under the impression that if you maximize eligible voter turnout, if you make it easier and more convenient for eligible voters to vote, they don't think they can win elections. Donald Trump has said it. Lindsey Graham has said it. Various Republican attorneys and attorneys general have talked about it. And this is a great example of it. So now if this is appealed, Luke, it's got to make its way back before the Supreme Court of the United States, which has a 6-3 conservative supermajority. Now, as Janai Nelson pointed out in that clip, well, hey, John Roberts said when he struck down Section 5 protections, he's like, well, at least I left you Section 2. So you might be thinking, well, at least we can count on John Roberts to be consistent and principled, right, and defend Section 2. Why on earth would we believe that? We're not in a good place if we're allowing voting rights for people in this country to hinge on this iteration of the Supreme Court. And the last thing I'll say before I throw it back to you is the Alabama case is a great example. You brought that up. We got a second black majority district in Alabama, which will help reshape the House of Representatives. That's a meaningful, tangible result on a national level, in addition to helping out voters in that state. If this case had been adjudicated a year ago, the way that it was, that probably wouldn't have happened.
One of the freakiest aspects of all of this, Josiah, is if you have, for example, Trump as president, his attorney general, that's now the person who can challenge these horribly gerrymandered, in the case of what we're talking about with Alabama, anti-democratic maps. And we're going to be hopeful that a Trump attorney general is going to fight for democracy on the issue. Of course not. The other thing is, you talked about how this aligns with the goals of this right-wing ideology. And it got me thinking about, it sometimes feels like the ideology that Trump holds, this anti-democratic belief that he's more important than our democracy, that power is more important than our democratic process, that it came out of nowhere almost. Oh my gosh, all of a sudden Trump's trying to block the peaceful transfer of power and install himself as the president. And now his followers seem just perfectly great with the idea of a dictatorship because they like him more than our democratic process. But it really didn't come out of nowhere. It got super severe with Trump, and it's threatening the very core of our democracy like it hasn't in the past. But the type of behavior that this decision is going to enable, the reason why a lot of Republicans right now are pretty excited by this, that has been present for some time. The belief that attaining power is more important than upholding our democracy and trying to give people the proper voice within that democracy. And that's only bolstered by this, which is really unfortunate.
Yeah, I mean, you even see a full retreat by the Republican Party and the right wing in this country from the word democracy. How many times have you heard or read? We're not a democracy, we're a republic, which is like saying, I'm not a fruit, I'm a banana. And it's, because we're both. We're a constitutional democratic republic. But they associate the word democracy with majority rule, which, by the way, and I say this as on balance, I really do say this on balance, majority rule for most things, that is the way that the United States was constructed. That is the way we should be doing things. People talk about a tyranny of the majority. Fair enough. That's why you should enshrine the rights of the minority
too, yeah.
and minorities. But what about a tyranny of the minority? That makes even less sense than a tyranny of the majority, but that's what Republicans are down for, Luke. They understand that their policies are not popular, and rather than moderate their rhetoric or moderate their policies and try to do outreach, they just say, no, we're enshrining minority rule in this country. We're exacerbating our institutional advantage, and that's exactly what this ruling is. This is a way to constrict the public's ability, I would argue right, but at least ability to challenge oppressive institutions like restricting voting rights. This is simply a way to basically cut off democracy in a way that they think advantages them. And the sad thing is, it does. Because the other thing I'll remind people is 30 out of 50 states in this country are controlled by Republican legislators. It is true. That's why, Liz Cheney's been going on the stump talking about how the last thing we need in the 2024 election is Mike Johnson and the Republican Party being in a position that if for whatever reason the electoral count has to get thrown to the House of Representatives and then the House of Representatives has to decide who is president, it's going to be Trump.
And when we hear, you mentioned the statements we've heard from Trump in the past and Lindsey Graham, is there ever a moment of introspection where they know we have to do all of this institutional stuff, do all these different things to prevent really the actual voice of the American people from being accurately, properly heard? And they admit, if you made it really easy to vote, regardless of their conspiracy theories or separate from their conspiracy theories about widespread voter fraud, even those that admit, okay, yeah, we have a secure election system, but it's still, why are you going to make it so easy? Oh my gosh. It's because they know that if it was convenient, if people were able to go have their voice heard, most likely Republicans would lose so much more. That's what we've seen in the data. And I wish that would make them think a little bit, because, and I guess they give us some thought, and then it's, we value power more than we value our democratic process. But there's another option. Instead of doing all this, the long-term play to try to make sure that you have these institutional advantages so that you can win enough elections to have power to do that, you could just be a little bit more reasonable on stuff.
You try to persuade people.
Crazy.
So, Luke, where can people find you?
You can find me at just Luke Beasley on YouTube. It'll be great to see you all there. And Josiah, it's been a blast.
Yes, it has, Luke.